Tonight, a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis. A shortage of supply is now causing problems for our economy, health, education and justice systems. We've assembled an expert panel to discuss the challenges and the possible solutions. And the fallout from the conviction of the former Sinn Féin press officer Michael McMonigal on child sex offences rumbles on. We ask how much pressure the party is under on both sides of the border. Hello. Many of the biggest challenges facing the Stormont executive are rooted in the long-standing failure to build enough houses. There's no shortage of statistics to prove the point. We know the price of renting a home here is up on average by 10% in the past year. House prices are up 5%, and Tuesday's Spotlight programme revealed how some people have taken to sleeping in hospital waiting rooms while others are committing low-level crimes to secure a warm bed in prison. So how do our politicians and decision-makers get to grips with the situation? With me now are Professor Paddy Gray, a former president of the Chartered Institute of Housing, the economist Richard Ramsay, Dr. Ciara Fitzpatrick from Ulster University and the head of the Housing Executive, Gráinne Long. Welcome to all of you, and thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme tonight. Professor Paddy Gray, first of all, this is an issue that impacts social housing and also private housing. What's the scale of the challenge we're currently facing in your view?
The scale is very high. Mark, there is a crisis at the moment. House prices have been rising, rents are rising, and mortgage interest rates have been rising. So many people are being locked out of housing. They're not being able to get access to either of the tenures. I see it as a crisis, and I think that we really need to do something very soon. The figures themselves demonstrate the rising waiting lists, the fact that people can't get access to good quality, affordable housing, and that people are sleeping on the streets or living in intolerable conditions. So I would say it's a housing emergency.
Paddy Gray, Gráinne Long is using the word crisis. Your organisation is Northern Ireland's biggest landlord. Do you use the word crisis?
Well, I think the numbers do speak for themselves, and there's no getting away from that. Our housing waiting list is the highest it's been. Homelessness and certainly the demand for temporary accommodation has soared since the pandemic for a number of reasons, including the economic shock following the pandemic. I think what we need to be very, very clear about, though, is that we know what the solutions are, and that we need to focus on those solutions. You're absolutely right. We need to recognise the fact that housing is core to economic growth. So it is infrastructure, it's economic, it's social and it's environmental infrastructure. So the solutions are there. We need to start building. So the Housing Executive needs to start building again. We haven't built for 25, 26 years. We haven't been allowed to do that. So that's really, really important. We're seeing the impact now of 26 years of not allowing the Public Housing Authority to build. But we need to do that alongside housing associations. So we need to make sure that we're doing that. We need much better use of public land. I think we talk a lot about the investment needed, the cash investment needed for housing, and that's certainly the case. But in Northern Ireland, we're not great at bringing public sector land forward. And so the solutions that I think we're beginning to see in the programme for government, the draft programme for government, do recognise that housing is core to growth. But I think it also needs to recognise and will recognise that the solutions are there, but they need to be introduced urgently. We need to be very, very careful that we don't suggest that this is too difficult a problem to solve. It's not too difficult. It's been done before.
Yeah, but it is on a very significant scale, as you have said yourself. You've talked about the urgency with which the matter needs to be addressed. And already, just a couple of minutes into this conversation, we've used the word crisis and we've used the word emergency. It's going to take something very dramatic in terms of an intervention to deal with a waiting list that's sitting at the moment. And I know it's complicated and it needs a bit of explanation, but it is about 30,000 at the moment, isn't it?
So the waiting is actually higher than that. It's 47,000, but those in housing stress, so most in need, are about 36,000. I think what's really, really important here is that we're clear about what needs to be done in the immediate, and that there are immediate solutions that need to be put in place, and then over the longer term. So what do we need to do? We need to build certainly 2,000 homes a year. The Housing Executive bid funding for 2,000 homes this year. We've only received funding for 600 so far to commission housing associations to build 600. Now, we know Minister Lyons is urgently and is advocating additional capital funding, and that's absolutely welcome, but we need to see that now coming forward. But I think housing associations and all providers of housing including across the private sector, needs certainty. And I think what we've done for too long is not focus housing as infrastructure and not invest in it over the long term. So I'm funding and I'm commissioning housing associations on a year-by-year basis. It's extremely difficult to plan. It's very, very difficult to raise private finance, and it's very, very difficult to do that when we don't integrate all of our focus and all of our infrastructure. So finance is key, and the solutions need to come forward now in the draft programme for government. But we do need to see capital subsidy, cash subsidy, sitting alongside land. My counterpart in England can assemble land. I can't assemble public sector land. So there are key interventions that happen in other jurisdictions that I'd love to be able to do, and I want to be able to get on and do.
We'll maybe tease out a bit more detail around those issues in a moment or two, but I want to talk to Ciara Fitzpatrick now about what impact all of this is having on people here. Anybody who saw the Spotlight programme on the BBC on Tuesday night will have been very shocked, I think, at the case of a number of vulnerable people living in very obvious, very painful housing stress. Just a couple of case studies. And obviously with a list the length of the housing list that we currently have that Gráinne's talked about, there are so many people experiencing that.
Absolutely. And look, I think it's actually worth taking a moment to look at what has happened in the last 20 years. We have seen the waiting list increase by 72% in 20 years, from around 27,000 in 2003-04 to now 47,000 people. The human impact of that, the human cost of that is absolutely colossal. Through my own voluntary work, I have supported a couple of people who have been homeless or in housing stress, and the mental health impact of that, the impact on their children, the impact on their children to be able to access education when they need to, when they're in temporary education or temporary accommodation, bearing in mind that we have over 4,500 children currently in temporary accommodation who are struggling to live every day in that uncertainty. So with all respect to what Gráinne is saying about the solutions that are needed, none of those solutions that Gráinne have outlined are tomorrow, are immediate. We're still looking at a draft programme for government. We're seeing more and more people go into housing stress, and there is no hope there. There's an absolute poverty of hope for those people who are experiencing homelessness right now.
Yeah, and what you're saying makes sense, of course, but I think Gráinne Long has said very clearly that there is urgency about dealing with these issues, but there is no magic wand to be waved, quite obviously. Any attempt to deal with the housing stress that these individuals are living in is going to take a period of time. I mean, what would you do differently to inject a bit more urgency into the process, if that was possible?
It really does feel like Groundhog Day having these conversations. Like, we're looking at a 20-year period. It aligns with political failure here in Northern Ireland, those long periods where we've had no devolved executive and absolutely nothing can be done. And now, we're 6-7 months into a brand new executive, and we're still talking about what has to happen down the line in a 2.5-year mandate. We need to see work commence absolutely immediately, and we need to see people thinking more imaginatively, more innovatively. How can we use any sort of space that we currently have, whether that be in town centres, whether that be looking at what is happening in the holiday rental market, where homes are holed up along the coast where we can't get access to them. We do have an executive now, and we need to see urgent legislation. We've seen legislation being turned around in a matter of days when it has to be. If this is the crisis which we are all agreeing that it is, then we need to see action immediately.
What impact, Richard Ramsey, is this having on the wider economy here? Again, we've got a sense of the scale of it, and we've got some sense of what needs to be done, though no clarity on how quickly it can actually be done. In the meantime, there is a price to be paid as far as the wider economic picture is concerned.
Yep, indeed. And I think housing and the housing issue, crisis, stroke, emergency, which is the seriousness of where we are with it. If we think back to the 1970s and 80s, unemployment was the key problem facing the economy, and we've largely sorted that out. Whereas I think in the rest of the 2020s and 2030s, it is going to be housing. The fact that we're underbuilding, that is having implications for in terms of what's happening with our rental sector as well. And it's not just social housing, it's private rental sector. We're seeing private sector rents have gone up by 40% since the pandemic. You know, so that's in the likes of Belfast, that's adding £300 or so per month on your monthly bills. We've got a skills shortage at the minute as well, and we're trying to attract more people in. We've got more inward migration coming in, and whether it's for people to work in our social care and health service, they're now finding that they're coming over and it's becoming less lucrative and less affordable for them to come in, particularly with what's happening in the rental sector. And it's a supply shortage, and that isn't going to get better anytime soon. It's going to get worse.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting thing is that what we need maybe more than anything is a joined-up approach, and it seems to be the one thing that we don't have is a joined-up approach, because what you're identifying there, in a sense, is a series of silos, and everybody can identify what the problem in front of him or her is, but they're not really able to relate that to the problem that somebody else alongside them is having. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, but what we're reaping now is what was sown or wasn't sown over the last 10, 15 years, because if we even think of in terms of our wastewater infrastructure, I was talking about that 15, 16 years ago. Every year people are talking about it. It's been known, but it's been ignored. And whether it's through not wanting to introduce water charges or not wanting to look at different funding models, we're now paying the price for the fact that wastewater infrastructure hasn't been sorted out. We now have 19,000 houses which cannot be completed or worked on because they cannot be connected to wastewater infrastructure. That's just a blockage. We have so many economic problems which are outside of our control: interest rates, what's happening in the Middle East, oil price, whatever. This is inside our control, and getting those 19,000 houses moving, getting the funding, that is going to be a large part of trying to improving the supply that we urgently need.
Paddy Gray, if we were looking for a solution here, I suppose we are all looking for a solution. If we were trying to find a way in which to join up the dots, what might that look like? I mean, there's a Commission for Housing in the South, for example, where the housing issue, if it's possible, seems to be even in an even worse position than it is up here. Would a Commission for Housing help move things forward in a useful way, in your view, do you think?
Absolutely, Mark. I mean, as you know, I was on the Housing Commission in the South, and when you look at the situation in the South in 2012, it's exactly what it was like. It's like here now. I mean, prices were rising, rents were rising, but what happened was there was a lot of stick and plaster from government, where they tried to solve one problem and to create another problem, and they eventually decided 2 years ago to set up a commission to look at the whole system and to change the system from the roots. Look again, not just housing, water infrastructure, health, all the right employment, communities, loneliness, looking at mental health and so forth. So there's so many things that have to be put into the mental pot, and I think this is something that we need to do urgently. Again, looking at Scotland, where I do some work there as well. 21 years ago, Glasgow City Council took a decision to take Glasgow City Council on them to borrow. Now, the House Executive, in my long career, which has been quite long, I've actually suggested many occasions that should be done. Many other people have suggested that the Executive themselves, they were building 5,000 houses a year in the 1970s and 1980s, that they should be allowed to borrow money to be able to increase supply. There are many ways of solving this. And, it's not just about capital funding. There are many other ways.
Well, there needs to be political will, does there?
There has to be political will. We have 20,000 empty properties in Northern Ireland. 20,000. And when we look at the waiting list, I know it's not as simple as that, but at the same time, there are so many things that could be looked at holistically. And that's where I believe a commission is important.
So, I suppose a couple of things, really. Do you think that a housing commission would be a good idea? And what about Paddy's suggestion there about a sticking plaster, which was the case in the Republic of Ireland? Are we going down that road here at the moment? I mean, you're having to spend your meagre funds compared to what you would like, paying, for example, for emergency beds, paying for taxis to move people who are in housing stress from one place to another, and that's money that you then can't spend on a lasting solution to this problem.
Yes, I mean, so Mark, I've listened very carefully to the panellists tonight, and I think, you know, as a housing professional, and I've been doing this for 25 years, it is very, very clear the actions that we need to take. The scale and the nature of our housing need in many ways is no different to how it has been in other jurisdictions and across Europe over various different times in that 25-year period. What do we need? We need to focus on new supply. That means putting the right land in the right places. It means putting the right interventions in place. It is not unduly complicated. If public land is released, if the right level of capital subsidy is put in place, and we build up to 2,000 and 3,000 homes.
So who makes that happen tomorrow then? Just to pick up on what Ciara said. Is that politicians?
It will absolutely need to be a Northern Ireland executive priority. Right. We bid for housing, we bid for funding for housing, and that decision will need to be made. We will.
Do you think that the politicians, and you talk to them regularly, sorry for cutting across you, but you know, I'm mindful of the fact that we don't have a lot of time. Do you believe that the politicians understand the scale and the nature of the problem, and do you think they have the will that is required to actually start finding solutions?
I do believe that, and I believe that because we speak to them all the time and we are making the strongest of cases, and I'm hearing very positive noises back. And I think that point about joined up government is really, really important. And if you look at the programme for government, there is a specific commitment in there to systems change in relation to young people.
Is that a draft proposal, as Ciara says, which is out for consultation?
Well, it's draft now, Mark, but you know, eventually it will be a final programme for government. And my job is to ensure that the system change that is needed is there. What I don't want is this suggestion that this will take years to happen. It will certainly take a long time for us to work our way through, but there are some critical asks and some critical actions that are needed and that we are, I hope, putting in place, including the housing executive being allowed to borrow. If you think back to the 70s and 80s, the housing executive was building 9,000 homes a year. Nobody regrets that investment now. If we had continued building on that level, at that level, some of those homes would be in surplus now. Not only would we have paid back all of the capital that was needed. So, you know, 20, 30 years from now, I hope there'll be people sitting on this panel, as Richard says, and we will have looked back and said, that crisis was solved. It didn't take 20 or 30 years. I absolutely am convinced, and I have 20 years experience in this, that if we focus our attention on this in 2 programmes for government, so 2 5-year periods or 1 investment strategy, we can break the back of this. And I suppose the final point I would make is the housing executive is still a major public landlord. This year, we will invest 280 million in our stock. That's regionally balanced investment.
Which is fine for the people who've got a house.
Absolutely is, and that's why public housing is so important.
Yeah.
You build it on public land, it's a public asset, it remains a public asset, and the people who stay in those homes also have that investment made. Okay. So our contracting partners, our local companies benefit from that. There's skills and skills development. So housing is a growth lever, as Richard has said, and I think the solutions are right in front of us, but we need the decisions to be taken, and we'll be ready to deliver. OK, so there's a positive note being struck by Gráinne, Ciara. It is a housing crisis, and we've identified that in the programme tonight, but it is also a crisis which seeps into hospital A&Es, as we've already discussed, and as Spotlight highlighted on Tuesday, and into our justice system, and into our wider economy, as Richard's just said.
Absolutely, and as I've discussed on this programme before, the cost of poverty is £1 billion per year because we're seeing those knock-on impacts of people who don't have a home, who are becoming dependent on other public services. And I suppose just to ask a question to Gráinne, what happens to those people who need temporary accommodation on a Friday night and are told that none is available? What can those people do in the immediate?
Okay. We're nearly out of time. We're nearly out of time. So you've got a couple of sentences to answer that question.
So we have a legal duty, and we don't walk away from that legal duty. It's very, very clear that our role is to house. And in fact, the legal duty to households in Northern Ireland is stronger, and I'm glad it is. So we will house people in temporary accommodation until we can find them social housing. And we've made a commitment not to place children in hotels and bed and breakfast. And if we have to, because there's no supply, we move them as quickly as we can. Our placements are to children in hotels in temporary accommodation are less than 2%. We've made a commitment to retain that level. And I think while it's cold comfort for those children in hotels now, we will move them as quickly as we can, and they have our commitment.
Richard, I'm going to give you literally a final sentence, if you would, for us. We've heard a lot that strikes a fairly depressing note in this conversation, but do you think, and you've been around a long time and you know a lot of the politicians, are there reasons to be positive as well?
Well, I would like to think there isn't the distraction of Brexit, there isn't the distraction of a pandemic, there's an executive back up and running, there's a new government in terms of the UK, and they've got to take this opportunity, and it's beyond social housing. It's, you know, how do we stimulate private sector building, private sector rental sector, build to rent? We need to move very fast because across the water they're looking to build 1.5 million houses, and there's only so many construction workers, and we need to get going.
OK, all right, we need to leave it there, folks. We're out of time. Thank you all very much indeed. Appreciate your time. It's a subject we'll come back to. If you didn't see that spotlight, by the way, on Tuesday, it's still available, of course, on the BBC iPlayer. Now, shortly, we'll discuss the political fallout for Sinn Féin, north and south of the Michael McMonagle case. But first, a look ahead to this weekend's Sunday politics. I've been speaking to the historian, Professor Diarmuid Ferriter, about his new book on the changing face of Ireland in the past quarter century. Here's a flavour of that conversation. What I'm interested to know is, when you sat down to do your research, when you went through the archives, did you get a sense, Diarmuid, that people in the Republic of Ireland now understand this place, Northern Ireland, better than they did 25 years ago?
No, I wouldn't say that at all. I think
Which is fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I think what has been remarkably durable is that gulf in understanding between North and South. There is a very strong sense of partitionism in the Republic. That is a legacy of a much earlier phase. It goes right back, of course, to the difficulties of the 1920s and the solutions that were derived in the 1920s.
Do you think it's almost subconscious?
No, I don't think. I think it is quite upfront for a lot of people. They consider Belfast to be another place, a place apart, even though it's only 100 miles up the road from Dublin. I think people deliberately switched off. I also think that because of the legacy of another event that will be marked next year, the Boundary Commission report, when the border was kind of settled, that there was a turning of the backs, and there was a sense that this is not a business we want to engage with now because we have so many other issues to deal with. That has lasting consequences because those attitudes are inherited as well, and there's a very strong sense of abandonment and a feeling of betrayal, and that endures as well.
And you can see that interview in full on this weekend's Sunday Politics. Now let's turn to the story that's dominated political discussion here for almost a fortnight: how Sinn Féin has handled the arrest and conviction of a former press officer who admitted responsibility for a string of child sex offences while working for the party. Here's a reminder of just what's happened.
Two Sinn Féin press officers have resigned after providing references for a former colleague, Michael McMonagle, who was later convicted of sex offences.
What I'm saying is I would have done due diligence if I was employing somebody myself. But secondly, what I'm saying is we have a legal responsibility not to interfere with the police investigation. We had no contact with that person afterwards. We did not know what he was doing or anything more about him.
I'm absolutely aghast and horrified the two former employees decided to give a reference to this individual. It would not have happened had they have come and asked for permission. They would not have been given permission. So I don't agree. It was wrong, absolutely wrong, and should not have happened.
We did the right thing. We conducted proper reviews, we liaised with the police, we did everything that is expected of us as a charity, and then to learn that perhaps there was some reference to us potentially falling short in that, that's damaging.
I am deeply sorry for the reputational damage caused to the British Heart Foundation, and I regret that this has happened, and I apologise for this. I did not see Michael McMonagle in the chamber. I accept that when you look at that photograph from that angle that it perhaps looks that perhaps I should have seen him, but I did not see Michael McMonagle that day. I would not stand here and make that statement if it were not true.
There's an issue in relation to how we protect children from sexual predators, and I'm sure that the leader of Sinn Féin will do the right thing on this in terms of answering very legitimate, important, fundamental questions.
Action has been taken. The two individuals concerned have lost their jobs. They are now no longer members of Sinn Féin.
Yes, I do apologise to them for not engaging in all of the facts in relation to the due diligence that issues that we talked about in some of the interviews. If I had known all of the facts, I certainly would have not made those comments.
Now let's discuss the issues the case raises for Sinn Féin with the political correspondent of the Irish News, John Manley, the Belfast Telegraph's crime correspondent, Alison Morris, and the commentator and one-time Sinn Féin election candidate, Chris Donnelly. Welcome to all of you. John Manley, first of all, this might not have been a problem of Sinn Féin's making, but it's certainly an exercise in how not to manage a crisis.
Yes, it's turned out to be a total mess, and I suppose has exposed the organisational chaos within Sinn Féin. There are clearly governance shortcomings that I think the party has acknowledged in terms of Mary Lou McDonald announcing the review. Whether it has wider consequences, I think that remains to be seen. It seems to be petering out, but as I wrote earlier this week, every new effort to draw a line under this story brings a fresh revelation and a fresh line of inquiry.
Yeah, Chris Donnelly, how damaging do you think the whole controversy has been for the Sinn Féin party machine and for brand Sinn Féin?
Yeah, I think there's no question that it's a damaging episode. I mean, in the first instance, it's obvious that the party has not come out of this particularly well. A number of levels, of course, they weren't to blame for the conduct of this particular individual. But then you go to the different episodes, you go through the two press officers signing the reference. Then I think what happened after that is crucial in understanding this. At that juncture, the performance of the leadership in the North was not what it should have been. They appeared quite rudderless. You had Conor Murphy coming out saying something which he clearly later regretted, which also I think showed that they, as a leadership level himself, and Michelle O'Neill in the North and others weren't fully aware of the story that people within their own party knew. And obviously then they were quite embarrassed when the British Heart Foundation announced that Saturday that there had been correspondence with someone within HR, within Sinn Féin. And then after that it comes out, Mary Lou McDonald tries to put the position out that it'll be an overhaul of governments. Really, when you rewind it back, they missed the person, Sean McGeer, who would have given that instruction. Yeah. And that suggests that, you know, at that veneer level, there's a problem. When you make reference to brand Sinn Féin, people in the North have gotten used to thinking this is an unassailable party, now riding high at every level, every election. And of course, that they worked hard to get to that level. So how they respond to this now, I think, is very important.
Because this is supposed to be the competent party of government, the lead party in the Stormont Assembly. And, you know, it is not over-egging the pudding to say it has looked like it's been at 6s and 7s over the past couple of weeks.
Look, Sinn Féin's greatest strength is it doesn't have party members or career politicians. It has activists, but that's also its greatest weakness when it comes to things like this, because most other parties would have had people who were maybe media professionals. They maybe would have brought in a crisis management company to try and deal with this. Sinn Féin relies on everything being done in-house. And the fact is, for years, that has worked to their benefit because they have an army of people they can send out to canvass during elections who will be loyal to them to a fault. But I think that there comes a time, if you're going to be a party of government, particularly if you're aspiring to be a party of government on both sides of the border, that they're going to have to start looking at hiring actual professionals to do these type of jobs. People who have a media background, people who maybe know exactly what is needed. Because if someone had have set them down that very first day this story broke and said, who knows what, who was told what, who had dealings with Michael McMonigal, they could have come out and dealt with the press in a very different way. Instead, they were defensive. That didn't look good. And then they've been on the back foot trying to fix that ever since.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that with John in a moment or two, but I want to just ask you about how damaging this has been, specifically for Michelle O'Neill, the woman who sells herself as a competent and appealing First Minister for all.
Well, Michelle O'Neill had managed to turn herself into, in the polls of the Belfast Telegraph run at least, the most popular leader, not just here in Northern Ireland, but also she was doing really well in polls in the South. And so I think in a lot of cases, that's why the party needs to reflect. You have sent Michelle O'Neill out to front up something which was indefensible, let's face it, really, in that first week, and that had damaged her personally. I'm sure she's very angry that she was sent out to try and defend a paedophile getting references. But at the same time, too, if you're going to be the leader of the party, I think there needs to become a time when they decide that this has to be done in a more professional manner. I think it was done in the way that was handled, the manner of the old Sinn Féin. Will it do or damage long term in Northern Ireland? No, it don't. And I don't think it'll actually electorally, because we've no elections coming up in the very near future anyway. And also we have other parties that have their own problems, which are going to come along the line in the very near future. In the South, it's a different matter because Southern voters aren't as loyal to a particular party. There's floating voters in the South who will go with whoever it is depending on issues, and so they don't have that voter loyalty that they would here, and people can change their mind depending on certain issues. Yeah,
I'll talk a bit more about what's happening in the South, or what's not happening in the South, in just a moment or two. John, just to go back to what Alison was talking about just a moment or two ago, the drip nature in which the information found its way into the public domain, the defensive approach that Sinn Féin took from the outset. You have had professional dealings with this party over many, many years. You know an awful lot of the individuals involved. Were you surprised that the party didn't do what Alison said it might well have done under the circumstances, which was go back and examine the facts and talk to people and be across all of the issues before you actually stand in front of a microphone?
Well, yes, and Chris has referenced Sean McGear's absence, but I can't believe that there isn't someone else with a helicopter view who could take control of this situation.
But there doesn't seem to have been.
No, it's been an absolute mess. They've basically stonewalled every question they've put to them. But again, that's illustrative of the lack of, Sinn Féin isn't used to dealing with the media. We've got to this situation where they tend to control the narrative by choosing who they speak to. So they're not used to being scrutinised by the media, and I think they ran scared from this.
So when they're on the back foot, it's a different matter. It has proved to be very difficult for the party.
It has clearly proved to be very difficult, and their first line of defence was deflection, and that backfired spectacularly.
Why was the party so dependent, seemingly, on the advice, the helicopter view, as John's just described it there, of someone like Sean McGear? And why is there nobody else who can do what he must have been doing in the past?
I think that speaks to what Alison was talking about, how the evolution of Sinn Féin, it's relied on people from its activist core who have been within the party for a very long period of time. Also, look, in the recent years, they've been very successful. So the approach, whilst it might have frustrated people within the media, that maybe Sean McGear was advising within his role, and the leadership obviously in the North were taken on board, it wasn't doing them a button of harm in terms of their electoral performance. But I think the importance in all this is, what does the party do now? What lessons do they learn from this in the North, this episode? Number one, I think the most important thing, and I say this is somebody involved in school, the overhaul of governance at Mary Lou McDonald has to reiterate to everyone within the party the importance of safeguarding and child protection, and how, whatever messaging within the party, there has to be that accountability. I think accountability is a key point. There's a very interesting letter in the Irish News today from Sean Seeley, a respected Republican, father of a Sinn Féin councillor, and he's quite scathing in it towards the Sinn Féin leadership, but he's someone very loyal to the party.
Catherine Seeley.
That's right, yeah. But someone who, if you read the letter, it's very interesting, because the points he's making, I think everyone within Sinn Féin needs to take on board. The need to be open, transparent, accountable. But moving forward, what do they do now? How do they replace their PR team? Do they go the route that Alison's talking about? Do they go outside? Do they get somebody at that professional level? Or do they try to train up someone inside, and perhaps that's not where going to get them to the point where they need to be quickly? But given that they are that party of government in the North, given that they aspire to be a party in government in the South at the same time?
Yeah, well, it's a big question, and we all look forward to finding out what the answer is. Alison mentioned elections a moment or two ago, and the next election here is, of course, 2.5 years away, but there will be a general election in the Republic in the next few months. Let's check in on to what extent this story has been making waves across the border. Gabia Gatavich-Keita is a political correspondent for the Irish Independent, and she joins me now from Dublin. Welcome to the programme, Gabia. Thanks for joining us. Has this story gained more traction in the past week than perhaps it did in the previous week?
Yes, absolutely. And just to cast viewers' minds back about 2 years, Sinn Féin was riding absolutely high in the polls. I think one poll had them in the high 30s. And it's certainly, the expectation was within all political circles, government parties or not, that Sinn Féin was nearly a done deal to go into government after the next general election. But where Sinn Féin finds itself now is that it has been slipping in the polls for the past 18 months. It's never really been able to come back from that dip that it has suffered. And really what it's dealing with now is every political party's worst nightmare in the eve of the general election. This scandal that's involving very serious accusations of that involve children, and the sexual abuse of children. Really, no political party wants to deal with this. It is a very difficult issue for them, and of course their handling of it has been lacklustre, to say the least. We're really expecting Taoiseach Simon Harris. It is his decision when to call the election. He could really turn around tomorrow, any day between now and spring, and call that general election. And so Sinn Féin does find itself definitely on the back foot. The story, I think, began breaking on Budget Day. That's the biggest political event. of the government here in the south. So the story really didn't get picked up until Mary Lou McDonald came out and made her statement, even though Michelle O'Neill had addressed that you had Sinn Féin TDs that were being asked about the issue on television programmes, and they were saying, well, look, Michelle O'Neill is leading on this, but it really became a big political story when Mary Lou McDonald spoke on it.
Can I just ask you, in a couple of sentences, Gabby, do you imagine the controversy will carry through to the election campaign in the South, whenever that is? Just briefly, if you would.
I think we're already in that general election campaign, even if the election is called in spring. Certainly when you see the back and forth within the Dáil, the story is going to continue into next week. So I think for sure this is something that will come back to haunt Sinn Féin. OK, Gabby, good to hear from you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. I just want to pick up on another issue now with my panel for the remaining time on the programme. And Alison, Gordon Lyons, of course, is the Housing Minister here in Northern Ireland. He's been facing questions this week because he's been discussing the housing challenge with the Loyalist Communities Council, which, of course, includes representatives of illegal paramilitary groups.
Well, it doesn't just include representatives of illegal paramilitary groups. It was set up to represent those illegal paramilitary groups. And that clip you showed earlier,
there are other voices in there as well.
That clip you showed earlier of the launch of the LCC, you could see me sitting at the front of that, and I remember the piece that was printed the next day. I was very sceptical that it was going to do what they said. They said at that time, we are here to help these paramilitary groups transition to what will be an old boys club. They haven't transitioned one single iota since then. And what I will say is there are loyalists at grassroots level doing amazing work in terms of education, underachievement, and working with young people, but they're not the LCC. The people in the LCC are the gatekeepers who are stopping those people, those women's groups, those youth groups, the people in those sectors from actually fulfilling their full potential, because they gatekeep all the funding, they gatekeep the access to ministers and politicians, and the politicians should not be meeting them in that forum. If those ministers want to know what's going on in their own communities, they should go out and speak to the people who are working at the cold face of that and stop trying to entertain these old men as if they somehow are the voice of loyalism.
Well, the LCC has had more access to DUP ministers than we have on this programme, though we do hope to be speaking to somebody from the DUP soon. John, loyalist paramilitaries have been accused of being responsible for putting people out of their homes in the past, yet their concerns are being raised in a face-to-face meeting with the minister responsible for housing.
Yeah, I don't know what the LCC is anymore. I know what it purported to be when it was set up, but it seems to have just morphed into a platform for David Campbell, and I'm not even sure what he knows about deprivation in unionist working class areas. He's a dairy farmer from Antrim.
Yeah, but I mean, he's taken on the job of chairing the LCC, and I mean, we are told that issues like loyalism being left behind and clearly housing issues were on the agenda whenever Gordon Lyons met. We know there was a meeting previously with another DUP minister, Paul Givan. The fact is that the LCC is there, and that the DUP leader Gavin Robinson's been defending his party representatives meeting with it.
Yeah, and it's unacceptable, especially when there are other organisations seeking access with ministers, including ourselves. But it's just, I think, I think that David Campbell. Sorry.
Okay. Let me bring in Chris while you get a drink of water there, John. The DUP, Chris, says it has a responsibility to ensure loyalist paramilitaries are encouraged to transition away from violence. We heard that from Gavin Robinson again. He says he will give no cover to them. Grassroots concerns within loyalism should not be ignored, he says briefly.
Shouldn't be, but we're 30 years after the loyalist ceasefires, so it's ridiculous to talk about transition. I do think the point needs to be made, what would be the response from the DUP leadership if Sinn Féin ministers were meeting to talk with representatives of dissident Republicans to talk about the siding of schools, education, underachievement and housing. I think we'd all know what the reaction would be. OK, got to leave it there, folks. We're out of time.
Thanks very much indeed for joining us. That's all we've got time for tonight. We'll be back on Sunday morning, the usual time of 10 o'clock on BBC One, when we'll have that interview with Professor Dermot Ferreter. Do join me for that. For now, though, from all of us, thanks for watching. Good night.